Welcome to Mastering Your World Through Frequencies. In this episode, there's an introduction, an interview, and most importantly, at the end, a group frequency calibration where the frequency work happens and change is catalyzed. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, this is Karen Cheong, and I'm here with my co-host Tia. Most of the great thought leaders, entrepreneurs, writers, business leaders, healers, artists, and even scientists are guided and inspired by something more than their minds. They follow the sometimes hard to discern, easy to dismiss guidance of their intuitive impulse. Today we're discussing the fine art of following our intuition, what to look out for, how to cultivate it, and the discipline required to sharpen our awareness of it. And after the discussion, we get to the most important part of this episode. The group frequency calibration at the end is where the frequency work happens and where change actually occurs. So be sure to listen to that. Without releasing distortion patterns targeted by the GFC, the change you want will be more difficult to attain because you haven't addressed the root of the issue. So let's get going.
Hi, Karen. Good to be here. So this is a great topic. I know I've had this question myself. A few friends I know have asked me this question. What is the difference between intuition and your thinking mind?
Yeah. So especially when you have more distortion patterns, it can be harder to tell, to be perfectly honest, because what you're perceiving often will be distortion, right? So you can't tell the difference between the two. And as you rise in frequency resonance and you release more distortion patterns, it becomes clearer. But to answer your question, one is that it comes with like a strong knowingness. And the second is more like chattery, and then it will like spin, it will devolve into a lot of what ifs. So the problem with having a lot of distortion patterns is the mind can kick in really quick and you can start to doubt. But I'll just give you a little story just to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is actually a story of Chris because he often will tell this story because he's like, I don't feel anything, I don't know anything. So he's like, but if this happened for me, it can happen for you. Okay, this is like his usual framework around this particular story. But what happened was my mom had fallen. Okay, so this is a number of years ago. She'd fallen and she had actually torn her meniscus and it had flipped like up, like your meniscus is like this over your knee. And so she tore it and it flipped like this. So it was upside down. And so she was in a lot of pain.
That's painful.
Yeah. So she couldn't stand up. She couldn't weight bear. It was like terrible. So of course, my father was alive at that time. They called us. They're like, what do we do? Right? Like mom, like obviously is in a lot of pain and can't move. Okay. So Chris starts driving because they lived in Oakland at the time and we lived in San Francisco. So he's got to cross the Bay Bridge in order to get to them, to pick them up because they don't have a car and they would be relying on public transit and my mom can't walk. So obviously someone has to go drive them. Okay. So Chris is on his way to go pick her up. And I'm like, where are you going to take her? And he's like, he paused for a second. I was talking to him on the phone, right? So I called him on the cell phone. I'm like, where are you taking her? And he's like, we're going to take her to, he's like, what you're going to do is read to me all the clinic locations of CPMC, okay, which is like a larger hospital network in San Francisco. I'm like, okay. So I Google it, and I don't know where they are because we don't typically go to the hospital. We don't have to, which is great, right? So I don't know where they all are. So I start reading him the locations, okay? And I'm like, what's odd about what he's asking me is that CPMC is a hospital network in San Francisco. My parents live in Oakland, right? So it's kind of like a little bit weird. So I'm like, all right. So I start reading him all the locations. And one of the locations, and the biggest one is in a neighborhood called Pacific Heights. And then I'm reading the location, and he says, that one. But the one that I'd read was in a neighborhood called the Castro, and it was a much smaller location. And he's like, that one, we have to bring her there. And I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, he's crossing the bridge, like, to go to Oakland. There are lots of other Oakland hospitals and whatever. But he's like, no, that's the one. I'm positive. I'm like, okay.
And you trust him?
Yeah, I trust him.
Yeah.
He was so strong in his knowingness, right? Yeah. And he's like, I know it doesn't make sense. It makes no logical sense, but I know that's where we have to take her. I'm like, okay. So he picks up my parents, right? He brings them all away. It's like an hour, okay, an hour and some to get there. And then he has to like fight traffic to come back. And my mom's in pain, right? So he's like, but he's following his intuition, right? Like I said, there are a lot of options in Oakland, but he was like, no, it's the one in the Castro. So he manages to get them to the Castro location. And they get a wheelchair and they get my mom into the wheelchair. And as he's wheeling my mother into this emergency room, which is small, literally at the same time, a man walks in. And he's a young man who's a doctor who's starting his shift, who happens to be the partner of one of our friends who's a real estate agent. And this guy looks at Chris, and Chris looks at the guy, and Chris is like, Alex? And Alex looks at Chris and goes, Chris? And he's like, yeah. And he's like, yeah. And so Alex says, I'm just about to start my shift. Like literally, they're crossing paths as they enter the emergency room.
Yeah.
So what happens? He knows us. So there's like this fast track of like, I don't know, magic that happens, including, by the way, he gets on the phone with the Stanford sports medicine people. And my mother ends up, I don't even know how this happens. She ends up having surgery like within 48 hours, like really fast, with the guy who does all the knee surgeries for the San Francisco 49ers. Like that's the guy who does her knee. Okay? I'm like, how did that happen?
Wow.
But if Chris hadn't listened, that wouldn't have happened.
No.
You know? It was like perfect. Like literally they were walking in at the same time.
They would have been waiting and waiting.
They would have been waiting and waiting, and who knows when she would have had the surgery, and who knows who would have done the surgery, and all this sort of stuff. And he's like, oh, I do knees all the time.
That's my thing.
It's my thing, right? Like that's what he does.
Wow.
And I was like, wow. So that's what happens when you follow your intuition. So for him, like again, that made no sense, right? Like logically, if you'd done the pros and cons, you would have been like crackpot, right? Like there's no way that makes sense to bring her all the way over here. You know what I mean?
Right.
In traffic, she's in pain, all this stuff. But when you fall, it was like such a strong knowingness for him. So to answer your first question, what's the difference between a thought and an intuition? It's that clear knowing. So for him, it was this like, I just know. I don't know why I know, but I just know for sure this is true.
Versus a thought could
Which is-
be,
yeah.
you can second guess the thought, like you're saying, and get really
yeah.
Oh, so location too. You know, just feeling in your body where
Exactly.
your intuition
It
comes
is.
from. If it's really up here,
here,
maybe not so
so
much.
much.
Gut, heart.
Yeah, exactly. So for him,
Yeah.
that thank you for that, because I was just going to say it's embodied. So he felt it in his body. He was just like, yes, with my whole being,
Okay.
I know.
Okay.
I know this is true. I'm not thinking it. Like with my whole beingness, I know that we have to go here, like without a shadow of a doubt. Now, the challenge with some people, including Chris sometimes, is that as time progresses, that starts to get muddy, right? Because the mind can come in, other people can be like, why are you taking her there? It doesn't make any sense, right? Like other people can get in the way.
And then you could doubt yourself.
Right? That happens a lot. And the thing is to trust that embodied feeling, right? So as you said, if it's all in the mind and it just happens up here, then it's less, it could be a thought, but when you feel it viscerally in the body and you have that embodied knowingness, that is a strong intuition. Now, some people also feel things like they'll know in their body and then they'll feel like goosebumpy. Like, for example, right? Like Chris will have flashes of insight. I don't know I'm talking about Chris all the time, but we are right now. But he'll have a flash of insight, and then for him, his confirmation is bodily. He'll get goosebumps, right? And he doesn't prompt the goosebumps.
No.
They just happen, you know?
Come on, okay, it's the right thing. Okay. No.
He just has them, and that's confirmation for him. It may be different for everyone else.
Yeah.
For me, and the thing is, here's the challenge. For most people, especially when they begin and they have a lot of distortion patterns, is it's hard for us to follow our intuition sometimes because, like I said, our mind wants to say, well, that doesn't make sense, and there's no knowingness. So it actually takes discipline to follow your intuition. And we're calling this segment the fine art of following your intuition. It's a fine art and it's a discipline, because sometimes or often you have to overcome your mind. So meaning it's like, I'm gonna follow this even though this makes no sense whatsoever. So just another little example. So I happened to be seeing another acupuncturist, because I see two of you, right? And I had gone to Jenny, my acupuncturist, for joint pain, because I'm having heat at night and pain in my joints. Okay, and so she was in flow and putting in needles. I don't know what her method is, but she was kind of just doing stuff. And she was like, she told me, okay, that's really weird. I know I have to put in points in your wrist, right here, and also in your foot. but I always put it in your foot first and then the wrist. But I keep checking with you, like your body. I keep feeling your body. And intuitively, I keep getting, it has to be in your wrist first and then your foot. She goes, this makes no sense. And likely you don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to follow that. Okay? So the way she usually puts it in, like foot first, it's to help quiet the mind or something like this. Help your Shen go to sleep, et cetera, because I was having challenges with sleep. She's like, I'm just going to do it, whatever. I'm just going to follow my instinct and do it. So she did it. And then she went to look it up. I was lying there, on the table. She goes, you know why it had to be in that order? Because in the order we did it, which is not the way I usually do it, it's for joint pain.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Yes.
So like when you follow,
Yes.
like she's like, all of her experience was telling her, do it the other way. And she's like, I just know.
And that's the discipline.
That's the discipline, to follow that.
Right, and not let your mind sway you to whatever way it wants to sway.
Or go into the certainty of like, I've always done this before.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so that's one of the challenges with the distortion patterns, especially at the beginning, is because it's like your mind can get in there and be like all telling you stuff. And you might want certainty of wanting to know. You know what I mean? Like the certainty of like, well, I'm pretty sure this is right. You know what I mean? But if you actually were to write down all the times, right, that you wanted to follow your intuition and then did not do it, you'd be like, right? There's so many times you're like, dang it, I knew that.
Yeah.
Like these things, it's like, when you're packing for a trip or whatever, and you're like, okay, I should pack this.
Oh yeah.
Right?
That
And you're
happens
like,
to me all the time.
right? So you're packing something and you're like, why do I don't need this. Like, why do I need this like rope, like piece of string or whatever, you're like, this is so random. Why do I need this? But then it ends up like and then you don't take it. And then you're 3 days into the trip, you're like, dang it, I need that piece of rope. I gotta buy
I feel like that happens to me all the time, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you're unsure and you don't want to move on your intuition at first because you're scared or you're not sure, just start writing down on your phone or in a little journal or like, something that you keep with you. Okay, my instinct is to do this. And then watch to see what happens. Just watch to see what happens. And that will start to give you confidence and like, okay, I knew this, I'm gonna do it.
Right,
I knew I'm gonna do it. Little tests. So you can just like, be like, okay, see, that worked out. I was right there. So it can give you a little bit more confidence.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, for some of you don't need that, right? Some of you are just like, I'm just gonna follow my intuition, right? Like I have no fear, I'm just gonna follow. So for you don't need that, but for some of you it's harder and you don't know the difference between your thoughts and your intuitions. So maybe writing things down can be helpful. And then I had this little thing called like a little intuition journal at the beginning, and I'd be like, it's a little thing. I'm like, see all those times? Yeah, intuition was right.
Cool. And then now you're like, okay, I'm done with that.
I'm done with that. I don't need it anymore.
Start trusting.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, would you say there's different like levels of, how would I word this? Like, I'll just give an example. Like when I was moving to Hawaii, that was a huge gut, like listening to that intuition. Like I could tell the story real quick. I was sitting on the beach. I had just come from a cruise. I'm in Hawaii. I never wanted to move to Hawaii. I'm not a big water person, but I just felt this pull, right? Yeah. And so I extended my trip. I stayed. All the signs were pointing to move to Hawaii. I was like, but I don't want to move to Hawaii. I literally was like, but no. And it was like, but go. Yeah. So, I had looked up what my dream job would be. I found it. I got chills. All the signs were there. And my mind would try to be like, but, there's no this or this or this or da-da-da. And I'm like, okay, I have, and then the volcanoes were going off. And I'm like, I have to go still. So that's like a strong one because it has to do with moving, whereas like when you're packing, the jacket or something, is it like less strong of a pull, or does it, as you're doing it more, like every intuition is just the same strength? Does that make sense?
I feel like there are different things that we get intuitive hits for, personally. Right? So for you, the Hawaii was a pivotal one for you, right? So meaning for you, it wasn't just like you said, packing something and whether you do it or not. So it's harder for some people when they hit those pivotal moments to listen to or follow like the chills, the goosebumps, the knowingness. It can be harder because there's more at risk, right? You're about to like take your whole life.
Oh, sure.
And like move it over.
And that's like you got to set the fear aside.
Yeah, you have to set the fear aside.
I almost feel like the smaller ones are harder for me because I can't tell if it's my mind just being like, oh, maybe I should grab that, or like grab that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would say that if you just, when it's like sort of random,
Yeah.
The more random it is, sometimes it's easier in a way because you're like, that's so random. Like, why do I want to pack that thing?
Right. Why would I be thinking
about that?
Because it's not thinking.
Because it's not thinking.
Cool.
Then you know. Okay.
Yeah.
So the more random it is, often that's intuition. That's for the small things.
Yeah.
For the big things, it's about governing your fear, right? So it's just like, man, this doesn't make any sense at all. Like we had the same thing when we moved to Hawaii. Like it made no sense for us either.
Zero. Yeah.
Zero. I was like, okay, we're just starting Spherical Luminosity. We know nobody on the island. We don't know how we're going to make money.
Yeah.
Like,
we don't know where we're going to live.
We don't know where we're going to live. We don't know how long we can afford to be here. We're moving all of our stuff, which is very expensive. But sure, we just feel like Chris was like, we got to go there. I'm like, okay. But you just, it's like, okay, you're going to go. So despite, the thing is, the mind wants certainty. And intuition is so much more than certainty. It's like, it's the being comfortable in the yet to be known, right? It's the not yet known. And that's what can be really scary for us. But what happens is the more you leap into the not yet knowns, the more you follow like your little intuition journal, the more you can trust yourself because you're like, it's worked every other time. Or the other thing you can do is to, if you get the chills or the bodily things, is to remember that you had them. Okay, so a pivotal moment for us is in 2013, we actually ended up journeying to New Zealand, which was a really big deal because that's when a lot of my inner vision stuff opened. Okay, that was one of my big moments. And when we were invited onto that trip, there was this moment in time, Chris and I were in the car driving a new friend to dinner, and he told us that he was going on a trip. He wanted to plan a trip to New Zealand. And in that moment for me, time got really long. And I was like, yes. Like, I don't even know what he's talking about, but whatever he's talking about, it's yes, because time got so weird. And Chris had a visceral knowing in that moment, like, yes, and we just kind of looked at each other. And we're like, yeah, we're going. And it's funny because leading up to that trip, there were so many things that went wrong. Like the person who was supposed to be giving it ended up stealing all the money and taking off. And like, we didn't know how we were going to afford it. We didn't know what we were going to do when we were going to land. Like all this crazy stuff happened, which were like logically pointing to do not go on this trip. But what I kept remembering was that feeling of time. I was like, that was not random. I'm going to hang on to that, right? So do you see what I'm saying? Like,
I do. I'm glad you said that because I think for the listeners it's important, and I want to share what happened to me, same thing.
Yeah.
So when I extended my trip in Hawaii, everything went wrong.
Yeah.
Like, so this was after the cruise, everyone went home, I was there by myself.
Yeah.
And I remember I had treated my family member right before they left because they were sick, and they felt amazing, and then I got sick. And then I got this horrible ear infection. And then like, it was like thing after thing. But there was bad things happening, but it was still in the flow. So like I was walking down the street and there was a clinic and they treated my thing for free, my ear thing. You know, like,
so it resolved.
It's bad, but it was still in the flow.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling that same kind of gut knowing that it's not what happens to you. It's how you kind of deal with it.
Yeah,
in
how
a
you
sense.
yeah, how you receive.
And I knew that I was like, no, that's not swaying me from coming. I'm still supposed to move here. Yeah. It was wild. So
So it's like you have obstacles, but you can still feel
that
like
your mind can trick you out of.
Exactly. But you're like, and yet all the obstacles are being resolved.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, crazy.
Yeah. So it's sort of like you these little pieces where you either are still in flow. There's like a physical trigger that you remember. Time is different. Something like this to anchor to that, right? Now, I'm not saying, so a lot of people will say, well, Karen, what happens if you're in a situation and you're being abused? Like, should you stay in it? No, you should not. You know, like if you're being abused or oppressed or dominated in some way, and your intuition is telling you to stay, really that is not a good thing for you.
No, because that's like bypassing the obvious, right? Like abuse is an obvious no.
Yeah, exactly.
Always, probably.
Yeah, and I would just say like you don't need to suffer in order to like validate your intuition. Does that make sense? So I just want to put it out there that like you don't. Does that make sense? Like you shouldn't have to, like it's not about testing you to see your resolve, you know what I mean? Like you don't have to like put yourself through that in order to have you be like worthy of your intuition or something working out for you or being in flow. Okay, so I just want to make that really
That's good to
clear.
see that, yeah.
Okay, and so sometimes, as you say, like, so to answer the question of like, well, what happens if things go wrong? Well, if they keep going wrong and there's no resolution ever, chances are you need to like deal with the distortion patterns to release them. Okay. However, if you receive an intuitive knowingness and obstacles come up like they did for you or they did for us, and there's resolution in some way, then following your intuition is good. Does that make sense? Okay, I just want to distinguish those two things.
Yeah, it's almost like just seeing the difference between doors closing, right? Where it's a very obvious like
Yeah.
close,
Yeah,
no. Or like when you're pushing against something, you know that?
Yeah.
You're pushing and it's just not
working.
Going.
Yeah.
That's a no.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that at that point, it's important to then surrender and let go of the mind.
Yes.
And then follow where flow is and come into neutrality, because often when we're pushing, and I've done this a lot in my life, where I've been pushing and pushing against something, trying to make it happen because I'm willing it to happen. Yeah. Chances are, like in those moments, it's actually very hard to receive intuition because you're so driven by will. You know what I mean? You're so trying to make something happen. It's difficult for intuition to come in at all. So in those moments, it's to catch yourself and be like, wow, I'm really noticing that I'm trying to make this happen because I want this outcome. Okay, so where are the patterns that I have to release? How do I come into more neutrality so I can just be with this and wait to see where the flow takes me next? Right? As opposed to, we all want resolution, right? Because we have minds and we're like, we want this to just end.
I guess most of us have preferences.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like holding your preferences loosely.
Yes. So you,
for
exactly.
the greater whole to kind of show you where.
Exactly. So to hold your preferences lightly, to not like will yourself into something, and then to hold your neutrality. And like I said, a lot of us want resolution one way or another. We want the certainty of that resolution. Yeah. But to wait until you get a strong yes into something else. Make sense?
Yeah.
Because sometimes we want resolution so badly, we'll just take whatever to just like have an answer that we can like move on.
Yes.
And this is something I have learned to be disciplined about also, is to be like, no, wait. Because the universe has never really been that subtle with me. It's usually like a kind of a clong over the head. You're like, okay, all right, well, I guess I'm going to do this now. Yeah. So it's just like, okay, well, when I have the yes, then I'm going to follow. Yeah. You know. So I would say that's important.
Yeah, and I think also, it never hurts to ask. Ask the universe, your higher self, whatever. It doesn't have to be something outside of you. It could be
yourself.
Your higher self. But that's what I just did with, we're thinking about buying a home in two different places, and it was very confusing of which way to go. And I just stopped everything, paused, asked, and now some doors are closing and others are opening. You can ask for clarity, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Even in the dreams, it comes up sometimes.
Yeah. And for those of you who have, now some of you, this will be challenging, okay? For those of you who have difficulty finding your zero and have challenges with multiple realities, or you have challenges with like entities or dead people coming into you, you will know this because your life is very, very difficult, and you know that there's something else running within you that you don't like and that you don't want, okay? If you have darkness that you have challenge with, okay, and many of you who have this are aware that you have it because you know something is wrong, it's harder for you to follow your intuition at first because you can't tell if it's your intuition or if it's the dark thing. Honestly, okay, it's a really big challenge for people who have this. Okay, so what I would say is, for those of you who have a challenge with this, I would say at first to hold and become aware more of strengthening your center, meaning releasing the darkness first, okay? So for these types of people, okay, this is a very specific subgroup of the population, to not listen to the voices, okay? Especially if they're voices, because the voices are typically the darkness, okay? Your intuition will be more of a feeling, all right, than it is words. So if you're getting like thoughts or like words, know that that probably is not something that's serving you, especially if it's like seems counter like to your well-being, for example, okay? So for you guys, please just work on strengthening your center, releasing the darkness out of you, okay? If you have to have IFCs or whatever it is that you need to do that, or just do more of the frequency work. That will make you stronger. Then some of you can push some of the lower level things out. You may need IFCs, you might need extra help for that. And then when you get strong enough, you'll find your intuition starts to flourish. Okay? So, but at the beginning, you need to deal with the other stuff first. Make sense? Yeah, because it's a very specific group.
Ooh, scary.
Yeah, it can be very disorienting and scary. Yeah.
Cool. I think we covered pretty much everything.
Yeah.
A lot of juicy info. I'm sure I would listen to this again because you gave us a lot of good tips. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Tia.
So we're about to start the group frequency calibration, where we actually do the frequency work and where change is catalyzed. To get to the GFC, click on the square that'll appear to the right or the link in the description below. Because I'm working on frequency level, GFCs are not like regular meditations. Many people go into a somewhat altered state, so please don't drive while listening to this. It's time to bring in a new experience, a new consciousness, and a new world. Let's rise together.